Yeah, thank you so much for that nice introduction. So, and thank you, Thomas, for inviting me to this event. Really been looking forward to this. So, I want to start by sharing something that I experienced in Nepal when I was living there. In the late 70s, I had already encountered some of the English translations of Kabir's poetry. But then when I went to Nepal, I realized that the life, poetry, mysticism around Kabir was very much alive. And I just want to share a brief experience I had while living in Nepal. And this is from my book, Sacred Body, Sacred Spirit. Once, while living on the banks of the Bagmati River in Nepal, I was walking down to the river to take my daily bath. After crossing one sand dune after another, I suddenly saw a flock of 100 swans in the distant sands. When I got closer, however, I realized the swans were people dressed in white. Sitting cross-legged, these 100 or so wandering ascetics were reciting the poetry of Kabir. After finishing my bath and my meditation on the riverbanks, I started to walk back to the small ashram where I was living. The swans of Kabir, these lovers of spiritual poetry, had mysteriously lifted and moved away, the footprints of their limber legs still visible in the sands. These swans were the Kabir Pantis, the followers of Kabir, very much alive and active in India today, probably numbering in millions of followers. So I'm so happy to be here with you, Thomas, to talk about your book, Painting from the Palette of Love. Now, it happened so that we were both introduced to the poetry of Kabir through Robert Bly, his Kabir book, 44 Ecstatic Poems of Kabir in the 70s. So I wanted to talk about your experience with Bly and share a little bit about how you decided, to translate the poetry, and also why you paint Kabir as a Sufi poet, because in India they think of him as a Hindu, or many anyway, and so on. So I wanted to talk a little bit about that.
Yes, well, we could talk for an hour about Robert Bly, but we won't do that. That would probably be just as interesting. But if you and those listening will forgive me, I'd like to read just a really very short paragraph to answer that question, if that's all right. So I'll do that. It says, my first introduction to Sufi poetry was by Robert Bly and his Kabir book, 44 of the Ecstatic Poems of Kabir, published in 1977. I had heard him read them in San Francisco when I was living there in the 1970s. Soon after that, I bought the book at the neighborhood used bookstore in North Beach. And some years later, I married a woman here in Jackson County, North Carolina, who was an ordained Sufi murid, a disciple. And I was thrown into the world of American Sufism in a major way, which included becoming familiar with many of the Sufi practices, as well as masters and poets from the present and the past. Since these years, I've been an avid student of the Sufi, Stoic, and Buddhist traditions, following more intensely the poetry coming from those spiritual traditions. So I've also translated 2 books of poetry of the poems of Hafez, who was a Sufi, or is at least identified more strongly as a Sufi than Kabir. Kabir is a more universal phenomenon or entity in the sense that he never identified himself with any one particular religion, but he's been embraced and accepted by practically everyone across the globe.
Yeah, exactly. He was, it is said that he was born in a Muslim family in Varanasi. But as you mentioned, he was as much adopted his poetry and his ideas by the Hindus and especially the Vaishnavas. So he lived about 500 years ago. His songs are recited in villages all over India today, in Bollywood, in the houses of the rich. What is it about Kabir that has made him so popular all over India and now throughout the world? And why is it that he is so relevant even today, 500 years later?
That's a big question, and it covers a lot of time because Kabir was alive for most of his life in the 15th century. So we're talking about quite a long life in terms of his work. Well, Kabir was a poet of the people, and he was outspoken, and he was very charismatic. He had a very charismatic voice and personality. And if I may be, so if you allow me to read a little bit more, I'll try to describe
Sure.
a little bit of that. I've written from all we know, Kabir, who lived from 1398 to 1455 in India, was a simple man and not actually a practicing ascetic as such, but a regular family man and part of a community where he was a weaver by vocation. When he died, both Hindus and Muslims were, he had inspired, claimed him, and as their own. He composed his verses with single Hindi words. Most of his work was concerned with devotion, mysticism, and discipline. And he urged people to look within and consider all human beings the manifestations of God's living forms. He was perceived for his views while he was alive. He was persecuted for his some of his beliefs while he was alive. He even stated, "Saints, I see the world is mad. If I tell the truth, they rush to beat me. If I lie, they trust me." So in our contemporary world today, this statement seems to be a little bit all too prophetic, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. He was definitely controversial. He was an iconoclast. He was, protesting against the dogmas of his time, and I think that is one of the reasons why he's still so relevant. Because, as you know, there is a growing tradition now of nationalism and religious dogma, and often the mixture of nationalism and dogma, and we see that even in India today. I want to share an experience. You said in the beginning we could talk for an hour about Robert Bly, and I think that one of the reasons why you are here and we are talking about this is because of Robert Bly. He was one of the first to translate Kabir into English, and I want to share an experience I had with Robert because this was probably 12 years ago or so. We invited him here to Asheville, and you, as a matter of fact, introduced him at the Wordham Theater in Asheville. And then we had the workshop the next day, and then he stayed over. And in the morning, I was taking him to the airport. It was 5 o'clock in the morning. His flight was leaving at 7. And he came out of his room disheveled as he was, with his hair, and he suddenly looked at me and he said, "What do you think this country needs?" And I'm thinking, yeah, maybe, higher taxes for the rich, something, political. But before I was able to say anything, he says, praise. And then he started reciting Kabir. What he meant was, what we need today is this bhakti energy, this love, this cosmic universal love that is really embedded in his poetry. And it is, you could say, the heartstring and the poetic voice of Kabir. So, in India, he's considered a bhakti poet in that sense, a love poet. And that's why your the beautiful title of your book is so, right on the point. Yeah, painting from the palette of love. So, in your translations, you worked, as I understand it, mainly from Rabindranath Tagore's English translation. And I remember I read in Robert's book, he called them hopeless, outdated, and they needed a new language. So you have modernized that language using terms like fancy restaurant, environmentalist, new age. So, which of course Kabir never used because he lived in a different time, in a different language, different culture. So can you please share with us the process that you've been working on with Kabir from Tagore's translations and then through the works of Bly and maybe others, how you have been doing that, because it's kind of untraditional way of using language from many, some maybe other people's point of view. So maybe you could share a little bit about your process.
Sure. Here we go. This is the book you're talking about, Tagore.
Okay.
Book that I worked out of or from. Basically, Tagore did translations from the original Hindi into English at the turn of the 20th century. And his book came out in the early part of the 20th century, these translations. And during the pandemic, I was just, looking for something to do at a certain point. And I picked up this book and was reading Kabir, because when I met Robert Bly, when I first read his translations of Kabir, it opened a door in my consciousness and in my life that I didn't even know was there, especially as a poet. And it hasn't been the same since. It was almost like I didn't need to write poetry anymore because Kabir says it all. And I didn't ever think that I could match what he has to say, and instead just share his work with other people instead of trying to duplicate it or write similar kinds of poetry on my own. I still feel that way. I've tried very hard to follow in his footsteps in certain ways, but that was a turning point for me. And I always wanted to try to do my own translations of Kabir, but I'd never gotten around to it until this pandemic. So I got into it, and I was reading, like you say, Bly said that these poems were useless practically because of the way that they were written and translated into English by someone who it was their second or third language back at the turn of the 20th century. So I wanted to, I found that to be true in this volume, and so I wanted to make it contemporary. I wanted it to speak the language and the phrasing of contemporary American and English-speaking readers, and so that's what I did. So I could read another very short little paragraph here that speaks to that, if I might. It basically says, while I'm not the only person doing modern English versions of Kabir's poetry, I am doing them in a particular way that is as true as possible to my own personal knowledge and experience of Sufi traditions, both East and West, in order to relay Kabir's message to a contemporary audience during a time when his poems and his message are essential, not only in terms of our mental and physical health, but to our very survival. So I believe that these poems in Painting from the Palette of Love are timely and of use to those of us here in Jackson County where I live and beyond. And I believe that. I think that my work has changed as a poet from somebody who just is a channel for whatever messages may come my way to being somewhat more concerned and focused on writing and doing things for the well-being of not only the humans on the planet, but all creatures and living things on our planet in this time when there is so much at stake.
Mm-hmm. You know, it is said that the poetry Kabir was in the form of Bani's utterances, expressions from the soul, from the spirit. And that is really what you're speaking to there. He was speaking from his spiritual experience. He was a saint and he was a mystic of the highest order. At the same time, he was an iconoclast. He criticized traditional religion, both Hindu and Muslim dogmas. He was fearless in that regard. He encouraged people, even demanded people to go deep within through ecstatic seeking and meditation. So I was wondering if you could read from the poem, The Breath of Wind, which I think speaks to that. It's on page 12 in your book, and then talk a little bit about the relevance of that poem for us today.
Okay, be happy to. It's titled The Breath of Wind Inside the Wind. I've got your back. You won't find me in shrines or in stupas, not in masses, nor with legs curled around my neck, or in some fancy restaurant. If you're really looking for me, I'm not hard to find. You will find me in some tiny house of time. Kabir says, "Oh, student, tell me, what is God? He is the breath of wind inside the wind." And it's hard to know exactly what Kabir might have been thinking or saying because it's all metaphorical and symbolic in a lot of ways. But he's the breath of wind inside the wind, which means he's not somebody walking around on the planet. He's not something on the planet that we can see, feel, and touch, but he's something inside of all that, or beyond all of that, aside from all of that. So he's giving you a clue of what he knows when he speaks of God, who he often addresses as the beloved, who he often addresses as he, and as we'll talk about also as she. So he's trying to prepare us for ourselves and to become more in relationship with ourselves in a totally inclusive and interdependent kind of way, which is foreign to most of us. We've not been raised or educated or practiced in these traditions. But Kabir is saying, 400 years ago or more, this is where we have to go as a species if we're going to prosper and survive. And he's giving us these clues, these metaphorical clues, as to how to think about that and how to proceed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, wonderful. When I hear that phrase, in legs curled around your neck, I think about, this idea that Hatha Yoga becoming, a perfect yogi, maybe aspiring to be on the cover of Yoga Journal isn't going to make it spiritually. That's kind of what comes to me when I hear that phrase. And even though that's of course in a modern contemporary way, but definitely it seems like Kabir was criticizing the yogis that were demonstrating their ability to master the body and control the body and so on, but basically saying the spirit is deep within the wind, deep within the breath, deep within the soul, as you're saying, and it's a universal phenomenon. And that is really, I feel, the beauty of Kabir, that you can be a Christian mystic or Christian spiritual person or Muslim or Hindu or Buddhist, and you can sense that universality in his message. And as you were just sharing. So another thing that I really liked about your book is that, and it's brilliantly done in a way. You divided it in two sections. Part one, and it's a very simple title, He, and part two is titled Her. Can you please share with us why you did that?
Well, in my journey to understand what is going on in the universe, I haven't found any definite proof that God is either male or female. And if you go back far enough into the cultures where the feminine was the dominant culture, the dominant sexual part of their cultures, God was addressed as female, or the spirits or the goddess were addressed in a feminine perspective. And so, and especially these days when the women's movement has risen out of the grave, more or less, and is becoming prominent in the Western cultures, thank goodness. I felt like it was only appropriate where Kabir addresses God as he, to give the feminine voice equal time. So after I'd done my basic translating, I went back and I divided the book into two different parts. And in the first part, he addresses, as Kabir did, the beloved as he, masculine, and then the second half of the book, I had him addressing the beloved as she. And I was a little bit weary about that because I didn't know how my publisher Shambhala was gonna take to that, and I didn't know how people were going to take to that, especially people that had Christian and Eastern religious backgrounds where God is addressed as he and believed to be masculine in some way. But I sent my translations to 3 or 4 of my women writer friends, and they loved it. And I said, well, this is a good sign. This is what I wanted to know, and this is what I wanted to hear. And so I left it, and then Shambhala, to their credit, thought it was a good idea too. So timing is everything, and the shift between masculine dominant aggressive cultures for the last hundreds of years, we're going through, I believe, a huge universal consciousness shift on the planet, where women not only have equal voice, but in some ways dominant voice. That was my thinking, and that's what I did.
Yeah, wonderful. I think that's brilliant. And yeah, and when I was listening to you, I was thinking about the language that Kabir used for God. Often at least in the Vaishnava tradition and in the Hindu tradition, he used the term Ram, but with the understanding that Ram is not God in the sort of personal form. God is nirguna. God is beyond form. God is non-dual. And this is, when he's criticizing the dogmas of religion, he's often coming back to that God has no form. God is beyond form. And at the same time, in all form, God is everywhere. God is sacred. God is the clay pot. And there's a poem which you have translated, I believe, where he talks about that. So for him, God is in things, but also beyond things, and that God is the nirguna, which is, as you beautifully explained, everywhere. Now, one of the things that Kabir and other poet saints in India talk a lot about is the problem of the ego, and that the ahamkara, as it's used in yoga philosophy, it's often seen as an obstacle to the spiritual. And so I was and Kabir, addresses this in many different poems. So I was wondering if you could read from the poem Pride and Vanity and share your thoughts about that poem.
Okay. Pride and Vanity. I have learned Sanskrit, and now all men think I'm wise. But how can I use this when I am floating adrift, parched with thirst and burning with the heat of desire? It's a total waste of time to take on a life of pride and vanity. Kabir says, lay all this down in the dust and then go to meet the beloved and address her as your master and your love. So they're saying that, our individual ego and vanity isn't going to get us where we need to go. That we need to go to somewhere or someone who knows the big picture. And these mystical Sufi saints apparently either knew or they were very close to knowing the big picture. And so they're saying, go to the beloved, go to the source, and go there and learn the doctrine and the practice and the consciousness of love. And I'm not talking about sexual love here. I'm talking about love on a universal scale that, according to people like Kabir and other high spiritual masters, say is the energy and the source that runs the universe. You plug it into the wall, and what you get is love. You plug it into the universal wall, and what you get from that machine is love, and that's very heady stuff, but it's very hopeful stuff, and it's very exciting stuff, and that, in my mind, is where human consciousness has to go if we're going to survive ourselves at this point in time in our history. And this is what Kabir says over and over and over in this book.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think you're so right. If there is any universal message, that is his message, that all we need is love, to use a cliche from the Beatles, but
Right.
but that's really the point of I think all of Kabir's poetry, that he speaks to that universal spiritual love, and basically what he's saying, it exists in all mysticism, irrespective of religion, irrespective of your spiritual path. and that I think is one of the main reasons why he's so popular. And as I mentioned in the beginning, has been cultivated that tradition, and his songs have spread all over. Speaking of that, I just remember something about the translation that you have done, working from Tagore, and then maybe got some inspiration from Bly. But that tradition is not new. It actually has been part of the tradition since Kabir's beginning, because even in India, and as you mentioned in the introduction in your book, we don't really know exactly that this poem was penned by Kabir. They have been elaborated upon, they have been retranslated, and so on and so forth. So it's a living tradition. And I was thinking about blues is similar. Many of the blues songs were kind of like that. They traveled along on the road on their own, and people changed the lyrics and the tune and so on. And so you are continuing that tradition, and that's really a wonderful, I think, metaphor for this poetry, that it is a living tradition, no matter what language is used.
Well, it's similar when you're just talking about poetry in general. That I've always related that my function as a poet was part of the bardic tradition. It comes out of the bardic tradition, which goes back hundreds and hundreds of years, and it was oral. It was before the printing press, and so poetry was spoken just like Kabir. Kabir didn't write down his poems; he spoke them, just organically, in the moment. And so, bardic poets, same thing. It was all oral, and it comes from hundreds of years of tradition. And so I'm very happy to be part of that long tradition, and that makes me feel good. What you just said, it makes me feel like maybe I'm doing something after all. But yeah, I agree.
So another thing that I think is very important about Kabir's message is his outspokenness against dogmas, against the caste system, against religious dogmas, and so on. I was just reminded of a story of Kabir. Whether this happened or not, we don't really know, but he was invited by some Brahmins, and he came with an entourage on a buffalo that had all the pots and pans you needed to cook when you lived outside or in a tent, and so these were Brahmin of high caste, and of course for them Kabir was an outcast or a lower caste, and in their tradition he was not supposed to eat from the same utensils as them, because that was sinful. And so instead of saying that directly, they wanted to test him, and because they figured, he doesn't know the Vedas because he's an outcast. So they said, the only people that can sit with us are the ones that know the Vedas. And the story goes that Kabir had the buffalo recite the Vedas. Again, a beautiful metaphor, or just a fancy story, we don't know, but it illustrates the kind of trickster character of Kabir, and how he was, always speaking out against these silly dogmas and against the hierarchy and of caste and so on. So in this system, unfortunately, is still very much alive in India. Casteism, is still alive. 150 Dalits, untouchables, in India today. So I was wondering, there's a poem that kind of speaks to that called "All the Same," and if you could read that and then maybe talk a little bit about that.
Okay. All the same. You don't need to ask a saint which caste he belongs to. For the priest, the general, the carpenter, and all 36 castes are all looking for God. The hairdresser and the maid are looking too. Everyone from all castes is making this pilgrimage. Hindus, Muslims, Buddhists, and Christians have all made this journey, and they are all the same. Which I think verifies what we were talking about earlier, that Kabir's work and message is really, is appropriate for not only all castes, but all religions and all people, because it encompasses a universal consciousness that is compassionate and interdependent with all of nature and everything, and it doesn't exclude anybody. No one's excluded. It doesn't matter if you go to church on Sunday in a Christian church or you practice your Buddhist practices on your own. We're all the same. And we all have the potential to achieve this higher consciousness and to move ahead. And this is what Kabir and Hafiz, Rumi, these poets are trying to give us a little push in that direction. And that's their message.
Yeah, beautiful. Well, we have maybe a few minutes left before we go to the questions. I was wondering, there is this one poem on page 19 called the Small Clay Bowl. The reason I wanted to maybe end with that is because it speaks so much to the importance of today, this idea of ecology, quantum physics, that everything is interconnected. This is a message that our civilization has totally lost. We have been too obsessed with quantity, and we lack quality and poetry and art and the cultivation of being attuned with nature and live an ecological, sustainable life and so on. And it's so beautiful because this poem to me speaks to that. It was created hundreds of years ago, but it is still so relevant today. So I was wondering if you could read that for us.
The small clay bowl. In this small clay bowl are fields and forests. It is there that the Creator resides. Within this bowl are the 7 oceans and all the stars in the sky. The sacred earth and the environmentalists live there too. In this bowl, the sound of eternity sings, as does the sacred spring. Kabir says, "Listen to me, my friend. The beloved lives inside of you." And that's the bottom line. You know, that we've been discussing here for the last 45 minutes or so is all part of it, part and parcel, pieces. But the bottom line is it's all about love. And all of this great big picture, it's all inside of each one of us. We're all built of we're all built of the same energies, and we just need to learn how to use them in the proper way to move ahead.
Right. Skål to that. Yeah. That consciousness as you know, I follow the path of tantric yoga, and that is, you know, as you know, very much the essence of tantra, that the divine is everywhere, and that is, as you have been saying several times, the essence of all mysticism and spirituality, and it exists in all of the religion. Beautiful. So I think it's time to maybe take some questions.
Yeah, we'll call.
So there's Patricia.
Hello.
Hello.
Hi. Thank you both so much, Thomas, for those wonderful readings, and Ramesh as well, and for a thought-provoking conversation. I'm looking forward to hearing some more from you. And we have a question for you, Thomas, and it is from Lisa. And Lisa asks that you could please, if you could please, speak about your work with New Native Press and the importance of preserving native languages.
Well, this could be a whole other Zoom conversation. Well, part of what's going on in terms of expanding consciousness in the human community, there's an awful lot going on in that realm now. I've been spending most of my time this last year or so investigating the different groups and people and things that are moving in that direction. And an important part of that movement, so to speak, is the incorporation of Native American traditions and values. And the Native American people are now stepping out of their silence, more or less, or their oppression, and speaking out and sharing their traditions and their beliefs and their values and their experiences over thousands of years that have been passed down. There's some great books out there by some incredible Native American writers about all of this and this coming together of the traditional Native cultures and this new expansion of consciousness in all other peoples. And so New Native Press is an homage to Native American values and traditions. And my own experience here in these mountains of Western North Carolina, I grew up in Graham County over in Robbinsville as a young person and spent a lot of my time with the Cherokee on the Snowbird Reservation. My name is taken from one of my best friends, a Cherokee friend of mine from my boyhood, David Crowe. And so I've embraced Native values in the ways that I can, and I've tried to learn as much as I could from people that I know and have respected over a course of a lifetime. And and I've published Native American poets and poets of other ethnicities and young poets to try to give a little boost to this movement that I'm referring to here today.
As a follow-up to that, Thomas, could you talk a little bit about how Indigenous or Native authors reach the press, contact the press? What's been your way for soliciting or getting Native communities aware of New Native Press, please?
Well, I'm not so concerned about promoting my own press as I am about promoting the ideas and the work of others who are sharing their wealth of knowledge with those of us who either don't have that or have forgotten it. So I'm not going to get into how I've done distribution and promotion of my press here today. I really am here to talk about the values of and the consciousness of poets like Kabir and how important they are to our time and place.
Can you talk about how you got your start as a writer and a poet, please?
Well, that's an easy one to answer. As a young boy in Graham County in North Carolina, over near Robbinsville, my mother would read to me each night before, well, as I went to bed. I'd be lying in bed my mom would come in and she'd read poetry to me almost all the time. Not all the time, but most of the time. A lot of it was poetry for written for children, like from poets like Edward Lear and other poets who wrote specifically for children. And so I learned, I developed an ear for poetry, and especially lyric and rhyming poetry. So when I got into high school, I was part of a rock band, and I was the lead singer. And that was the next step. The next step from that was moving to San Francisco after college and hanging out with the poets who I admired the most, which were mainly the beat poets, Berlinghetti, Ginsberg, Diane DePrima, Michael McClure, Bob Kaufman. This goes on. And I lived in San Francisco for many years, well, several years, with these people, and learned how to be a poet. And all that background of my mother reading to me, and the lyric and the rhyme sort of disappeared, as you know it did traditionally in Western culture, but the poetry remained, and I've kept with that process throughout my life, really. So that was how it started.
Ramesh, what about you?
What about me? In terms of poetry, or?
How did you get your start?
Well, I didn't have a mother that read poetry to me. I wasn't that lucky. She was, reading other stories. I grew up in Norway on an island in the Oslo Fjord. But I guess I was very much like Thomas, fond of nature, and kind of a contemplative kid. Spent a lot of time in the woods and on island. I got a boat when I was young, and just island hopping, and a very free life, And then I discovered poetry as I was growing up, primarily Norwegian poetry. And then I started writing poetry first, and then I was part of an anthology of young Norwegian poets. I had kind of was praised by some of the famous poets in Norway and so on. But strangely enough, I never continued the way that Thomas has in terms of poetry. And for many years, I wrote mainly articles and did interviews and so on. And then finally writing books. After I had started writing a book, and then I had this incredible dream of a snake biting my right hand, and I interpreted that to mean that you need to, your right hand is your writing hand, and the snake was telling me, wake up and be disciplined, because there's nothing called writer's block. The only problem with you is that you're not sitting down and being disciplined about your work. That's what I felt the snake was telling me. And from then on, that's 5 books ago, and from then on, I took the writing more seriously. And then Robert Bly is Norwegian-American, and I sent some of my poems to him over the years, and he liked them, and so and when we communicated back and forth, and then I invited him here to Asheville several times, and he opened my world to poets like Pablo Neruda and Kabir and Hafez and Rumi and so on. He was also, speaking of Rumi, the one that probably the main one that inspired Coleman Barks to translate Rumi. So that's a little bit about my writing journey.
Thank you. Thomas, if we could please talk about translating for a minute and the skills necessary. Were you challenged at all in translating for this book? And if so, what were they?
Well, I've been translating my whole adult life. French is my second language. I studied French in school and college, and then I lived in France. I left America. I wanted to be a French poet. All my favorite poets were French, so I figured, well, it's going to be for real. You need to be a French poet. So I moved to France, and so as a result of that second language, I've translated a good bit of material into French, some books and articles and poems and things. But when it came to translating Hafez, I discovered Hafez mainly through the Mayor Center down at North Myrtle Beach, which is a spiritual center honoring the Avatar Mayor Baba. And in the library there, I took some English translations of who Mayor Baba said was his favorite poet, Hafez, and was reading them, and I thought they were not very good. They were too formally literal in the forms that they were written in originally, the ghazal form. It's kind of a couplet, rhyming couplet, but into English it just didn't work. So I started translating the Hafez into open verse couplets instead, but to keep the message. I mean, that's the most important part. And I did the same thing with Kabir here recently. It's a real challenge. It's probably harder to do versions than the literal translating, knowing the other language. Because you can literally, from French to English, where you know the French word, you know the English word, and you can make those translations more direct and easily. But when you're doing a version of the language that is your main language, and to get it right. And I wanted to get it right. I didn't want to do a lot of crazy versioning, which has been done to the Sufi poets quite a bit, actually. It's not, some of it doesn't even resemble the original work. But I wanted to find that middle ground where the message was still prominent, but the language was more contemporary and the references more contemporary. The versioning, while some people might think it's kind of a half-ass way to translate, is really a little bit harder than doing the literal translating in my experience.
So are you working on something else? What might we, if you can talk about that, what's next?
Well, I've become a monk during COVID. I didn't go anywhere. I didn't do anything except for stay home until recently. And during that time, I've written 4 books. I had nothing else to do. But 2 of them might be appropriate. One of them was a Kabir book. One of them is a book called From Me to We, and it's a memoir, autobiographical memoir of all the different communities that I've lived in my lifetime, and I've lived in a lot. I was moved around a lot. When I was living with my parents, my father took new jobs and we moved all over the place. And so in each community, I had to integrate and become a part of that community. And this book, From Me to We, is about how I integrated into community and how I meshed with those communities and became a part of a community, not an individual doing his own thing, but a part of a community, which is the message that Kabir brings forth, and a lot of these spiritual teachers that are rising up now are talking about, that we need to start working in an integrated way with other people, groups, communities, nations, planets, working together. So that's what that book is about. And then the other one is called 9 Lives. And I've had near-death experiences 9 times in my life. my mother used to tell me, she said, "You've had 9 lives." And so I sat down one day and I just wrote out the different times when I either almost died or I could have died. And oddly enough, it turned out there were 9 of them. I figured that was a sign of some sort that I needed to write those down, and I have, and I've written them into a book about my consciousness and how each time that I almost died, I was able to raise my awareness and consciousness, because I'm a slow learner, and sometimes it takes the school of hard knocks to get through to me. And each time I've had these experiences, I've had the time and the focus to ask the questions of, why am I still alive? Why am I still here? So many people would have died and have died under lesser conditions. Why am I still here? And so asking those questions and trying to advance myself and my consciousness as a result of these accidents, so to speak, is what this book is about.
Well, we are at the top of the hour, and it has been a pleasure to welcome you both. And that's Thomas Rain Crowe in conversation today with his guest, Ramesh Bjonnes. And they've been talking about the book, Painting from the Palette of Love. And I want to thank you both for being here today to discuss the poetry of Kabir, and for sharing the ideas and insights that you, Thomas, have gained from doing this work, and you, Ramesh, from your own work and experiences as well. Thank you both for your time this afternoon. We really appreciate it. Thank you, audience.
Thank you.
Do we have just a couple minutes to leave the audience with a poem?
Yes, if you want to, that'll be fine.
Okay, I appreciate that. Because this poem in the book really kind of is a culmination of all the things we've been talking about, and it's called The Best Kind of Love. Speaker, the best kind of love is simple. It is free. Ever since the day when I met my beloved, there has been only fun in our love. I don't close my eyes and I don't close my ears. I see with my eyes open and with a smile, and see her beauty everywhere. When I speak her name, everything I see reminds me of her. And whatever I do, I'm praying to her. And all contradictions are solved. She is my true love. There are no others. And my lips sing to her glory both night and day. I can never forget her. For the rhythm of her music echoes in my ears. Kabir says, even if your heart breaks, tell her what you are hiding in your soul. The beloved's bliss is greater than all of life's pleasure and pain. So, thank you all.
Beautiful.
God bless. Have a good evening.
Beautiful.
Thank you so much.
you.
It was a pleasure to hear that poem, that final poem. Thank you, Thomas Rain Crowe and Ramesh Bjonnes. Thank you, audience.
Thank you, Patricia.
It's a pleasure.